At my wife's funeral, as I stood by her casket trying to keep myself together, my own son looked out at the mourners and said, "I was just a useless old man." Those words cut deeper than any knife, but I stayed silent, because I knew something he didn't, something his mother had left behind that would change everything he thought he knew. Thank you for watching my story today. I'd like you to take a moment and write in the comments where you are watching from. I truly appreciate having you here with me. My name is James. I am from West Virginia, and I have lived here all my life. I was married to my wife for 50 years, and in those years we built a life together, brick by brick, with our hands, with our sacrifices, and with our love. She was the steady one, the calm voice in every storm, and the kind of woman who could light up a room without ever trying. Together we raised a family, and even though times were not always easy, we never gave up on one another. I worked long days and longer nights to keep food on the table, sometimes taking on 2 jobs, sometimes going without so that they could have more. I never complained because I loved my family, and I believed that love and sacrifice would be remembered, respected, and honored. But as I stood at her funeral, hearing my son speak those cruel words, I felt the weight of 50 years press down on me like never before. It was as if all the nights of labor, all the small joys, all the laughter we shared, and all the moments she and I held hands through pain and struggle were swept aside in one sentence. That day I kept my silence because she had asked me not to fight, not to cause a scene, not to let bitterness take over the final memory of her resting place. And so I bit my tongue and stood still, even though inside my heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. I suppose I should tell you more about who I am, because stories only make sense when you understand the life behind them. My name is James, and I am 78 years old. I was born and raised in West Virginia, in a small town where neighbors knew one another and where every face was familiar. I grew up poor, the kind of poor where you learned to fix what was broken instead of buying new, where shoes had to last longer than they should, and where every meal on the table was a blessing you never took for granted. It was there that I learned the meaning of hard work, not in books or in classrooms, but in the fields, in the dust, and later in the factories where the sound of machines never stopped and the shifts seemed endless. When I met my wife, I was just a young man with calloused hands and little more than hope in my pocket. She was the kind of woman who carried grace in her smile and kindness in her voice, and somehow she chose me. We married young, too young by some people's standards, but we didn't care because we had each other. For 50 years we built our home, not just a house of wood and stone, but a life filled with memories, arguments that ended with laughter, and quiet nights when holding hands said more than words ever could. She gave me strength when I felt weak, and when life tested me, she reminded me that love was not just a feeling, but a choice we kept making every single day. We raised our children together, and though I worked long hours to provide for them, I never thought of myself as absent, because every moment I could, I was there. I carried them on my shoulders when they were small, taught them how to ride their bikes, and stayed up nights when they were sick. I gave them what I never had, a home filled with stability and a father who kept his promises. But as the years went by, I began to notice how my son, the one who stood at his mother's funeral and spoke against me, grew more distant, more demanding, more convinced that the world owed him something. He was bright, yes, and he had opportunities I never dreamed of, but along with that came a pride that sometimes frightened me. Still, I believed in him. I trusted that time and experience would humble him, and I thought that one day he would look back and see the sacrifices his parents had made for him. When my wife fell ill, it was one of the hardest seasons of my life. I watched her weaken slowly, and I did everything I could to make her days easier, even though my body was tired and my own health was not what it used to be. She never complained, never let her pain become heavier than my shoulders could carry. And before she passed, she looked at me and said words I will never forget. "James, promise me you will not fight at my funeral. Let me handle it in my way." At the time, I did not fully understand, but I trusted her, as I always had. That promise was the reason I stood silent when my son called me useless, even though every bone in my body wanted to shout back. It was not weakness. It was respect for the woman I loved, because she had something planned, and she wanted me to wait for the moment when truth would speak louder than my voice ever could. The day of the funeral was heavy, not only with grief, but with the strange kind of silence that settles in when a room is filled with people who do not know what to say. I remember the church filled with flowers, the smell of lilies so strong it almost drowned out the scent of old wooden pews. My wife's picture sat at the front near her casket, her smile captured in a frame, reminding me of the woman who had given her whole life to love and family. People whispered as they came in, some patting me on the shoulder, some offering words of comfort that barely reached my ears because my heart was so loud in its sorrow. I tried to stand tall, tried to honor her by keeping my composure, but inside I felt like a man torn in half. When the time came for words to be spoken, I thought it would be a moment of honor, a time for stories of her kindness, her laughter, and her unwavering strength. My son walked to the front, and for a brief second I allowed myself to believe he might finally show gratitude, might speak of his mother's sacrifice and her devotion. But as he opened his mouth, the words that came out struck me like cold iron. He looked directly at me, his voice firm, and said I was nothing but a useless old man. The room grew tense, some guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others lowering their heads as if ashamed for him. My chest tightened, not just from the insult, but from the cruel timing, for he chose the day we laid his mother to rest to humiliate me before everyone who had come to honor her. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to tell the truth of the nights I worked while he slept, the sacrifices I made when he was too young to notice, the way I carried burdens silently, so he would never feel their weight. But I remembered my promise to my wife, the promise that I would not fight on this day, the promise that her plan would speak for itself. So I held my tongue even though my heart was burning, and I stood still as his words echoed across the room. Some people glanced at me with pity, others with surprise, but I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I lowered my head, not in shame, but in restraint, because I knew something he did not. I knew that his mother had left more than memories behind. She had left her truth sealed in ink, waiting to be read, and it would speak louder than any cruel word he had spoken in that church. As I stood there in that church, holding my silence like a shield, I could feel the weight of eyes on me. Some looked shocked, others looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke against my son. I could hear the low rustle of whispers moving through the pews, people leaning toward each other, wondering how a man could say such words to his father on the very day his mother was laid to rest. My hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from the effort it took to keep myself still. Every insult I had endured in life seemed to gather in that moment, every sacrifice dismissed, every hour I had given of myself without complaint, all reduced in a single cruel sentence. And yet, in my heart, a quiet voice reminded me of her last request. She had asked me not to fight, not to let rage or bitterness stain her final farewell. She had promised me that truth would reveal itself in time, and I trusted her even beyond the grave. It was then that I felt a gentle touch on my arm. One of my grandchildren leaned closer, their small voice whispering, "Don't listen, Grandpa." Grandma knew. Those words settled inside me, like a stone of strength. It was a reminder that not everyone shared my son's arrogance, that the love and respect I had given had not been forgotten by all. I held on to that whisper as though it were her voice speaking through them, as though she was telling me once again to wait, to trust. My eyes lifted to the photograph of my wife resting near the casket, her smile frozen in that frame, and I thought to myself, how even now she was guiding me. I let my son's words pass like wind against a mountain, loud in the moment, but powerless to move what was rooted deep. I chose silence, not because I was weak, but because I understood that sometimes the greatest strength is to wait. He thought he had buried me with his mother that day, that his insult had carved away the last of my dignity, but he did not know what awaited him. He did not know that she had left behind her voice, written and sealed, waiting in the care of her lawyer. That letter carried more weight than anything spoken that day, and soon the truth would speak so loudly that not even his pride could silence it. The service ended. and people began to file out of the church, some stopping briefly to shake my hand or offer words of comfort, though their eyes still carried the shadow of what had been said. I nodded politely, I thanked them softly, but inside I was holding everything together by a single thread. My son moved about the room as if nothing had happened, speaking to guests, shaking hands, and even laughing at moments, as though his cruel words had been nothing more than a passing remark. I stood there in silence, letting him carry himself in arrogance, because I knew a storm was waiting just beyond his sight. As I stepped outside, the air was cool, the sky heavy with gray clouds, and the scent of rain mixed with the fragrance of flowers people had left behind. A friend of my wife, a woman who had known her since childhood, walked up to me and whispered, "She told me to remind you, James. She said not to let anyone break your spirit today. She had things arranged." Her words settled into me like a gentle hand pressing on my back, pushing me forward when I felt I could collapse. I could almost hear my wife's voice in that moment, steady and certain, telling me to endure, to wait, to let her love speak after her. That night I sat in our quiet home, every corner filled with memories of her. The chair where she used to sit with her sewing, the table where we shared countless meals, the old record player she loved to use when she wanted to dance in the kitchen. I felt the ache of her absence in every room, and I replayed my son's words over and over, each time cutting deeper. Yet even in that darkness, there was a flicker of strength, because I knew she had prepared something. She had not left this world without making sure her truth would be known. The next morning, I put on my suit again, the same one I had worn for her funeral, and walked slowly to the lawyer's office. My son arrived ahead of me, smug and certain, his chest puffed as though the world already belonged to him. He barely acknowledged me as I entered, choosing instead to smirk and fold his arms, as though victory was already his. He had no idea what was about to be revealed, no idea that his mother's voice would rise again through the letter she had left behind, and that every arrogant word he had spoken would be swallowed in the silence that followed her truth. When I walked into that office, the air felt heavier than the gray sky outside, as though even the walls were holding their breath. The lawyer stood as I entered, his face kind but serious, and on the desk before him lay a sealed envelope, the handwriting on it instantly familiar. My heart trembled at the sight, because I knew those letters. I had seen them for decades on notes she left for me by the coffee pot, or in the corners of birthday cards, or on the shopping lists she carefully prepared. That handwriting was hers, and even though she was gone, it felt as though her hand was still guiding me. My son sat across from the desk, leaning back in the chair with his arms crossed, a grin tugging at the edge of his mouth as though he was already celebrating what he thought was his. He barely looked at me, only gave me the kind of glance you give someone you believe is beneath you, and then he turned his attention back to the lawyer, impatient for the moment when everything would be handed over. I lowered myself into the chair, my body tired, but my spirit stronger than it had been the night before, because I knew something he didn't. The lawyer cleared his throat, his hands steady as he lifted the envelope and broke the seal. The sound of the paper tearing seemed louder than anything else in the room, echoing against the silence. My son leaned forward now, hungry, his pride swelling as if he was about to be crowned king of something he believed he deserved. I simply folded my hands in my lap, waiting, remembering my wife's last words, remembering the promise I had made to her to hold my tongue until the time was right. The lawyer opened the folded paper and began to read. His voice was measured, each word falling with a weight that filled the room. I closed my eyes for a moment as I heard her words spoken aloud, because it was as though she had never left me, as though she was sitting right there in that office, speaking herself. My son shifted in his chair, his smug grin fading as the words carried on, and for the first time since the funeral, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. He had walked into that office expecting everything, but he was about to learn that arrogance blinds, and that his mother's love and her judgment were far stronger than his pride. The lawyer's voice carried steady in that room, and each line of her letter seemed to paint a picture of the life we had shared. She spoke of our early years, how we started with almost nothing but built everything together, how I worked long hours while she kept the home warm, how every sacrifice was made side by side. Her words were not written in haste, they were carefully chosen, filled with gratitude and love, and they reminded me of nights when we had nothing but faith in each other. Nights when she told me that, no matter how small the world made me feel, in her eyes, I was enough. I sat there listening, my chest tightening with both pain and pride, because even in death she was still defending me, still giving me strength when I needed it most. Then her words turned, and she spoke directly to our son. Her tone, though written, was firm, sharper than I had ever heard her in life. She wrote that respect was not earned by arrogance or by demanding it, but by giving it. That true wealth was not measured in money or houses, but in loyalty, humility, and kindness. She reminded him of the times she had watched him dismiss me, the moments he turned his back when I asked for little more than his time, the way he looked at me as though my years of work and sacrifice were nothing. She told him clearly that until he could learn respect, until he could understand the meaning of gratitude, he would not inherit a thing. My son's face flushed red as the lawyer read those lines, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting nervously around the room as though searching for someone to defend him. The confidence he had carried into that office drained with each word, and the smirk that had rested on his lips was long gone. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unable to meet my eyes, and for the first time I saw the pride that had always shielded him begin to crack. The lawyer's voice never wavered, and when he reached the part where she left everything in my name, he paused briefly, letting the silence hold the weight of her decision. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, not from triumph, but from the deep knowledge that she had loved me enough to protect my dignity even after she was gone. In that moment, her voice was stronger than any insult spoken at her funeral, and the truth had finally been laid bare. When the lawyer finished reading her words, the room fell into a silence so thick it seemed even the air refused to move. My son sat there stunned, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as if holding on to something that had already slipped away. His eyes darted from the lawyer to me and back again, but he found no comfort in either of us. He opened his mouth once as if to argue, but no sound came, and when he finally managed to speak, it was a broken whisper, a far cry from the boldness he had carried into that office. He muttered that it wasn't fair, that she had been confused, that I must have somehow convinced her, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew, deep down, that those words were hers alone, born from a lifetime of watching, of knowing, of loving, and of seeing the truth for what it was. The lawyer cleared his throat and repeated her final instruction, that all property, accounts, and possessions were to remain under my care. My son's face turned pale as if he had just watched his future vanish before his eyes, because in truth, he had. For years he had believed that everything would one day belong to him, that my efforts and her patience were merely stepping stones to his own comfort. But now he was forced to face the reality that arrogance had cost him dearly, and that respect withheld had returned to him in the form of emptiness. I sat quietly through it all, not gloating, not triumphant, but deeply moved by the power of her love, a love that had reached beyond the grave to restore what he had tried to take from me. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had labored for decades, scarred and rough from years of work, and for the first time in many years, I felt they were truly seen. She had made sure that the world would remember my worth, that our son would know I was not useless, that I had never been useless. I lifted my eyes and met his gaze, and though he quickly looked away, in that brief moment, I knew he understood. He had tried to bury me with words at her funeral, but she had raised me back up with her letter, and nothing he said could undo that truth. My son could not contain himself any longer, and his voice finally broke the silence in that room, rising sharp and angry as he slammed his hand on the table, demanding that the letter be dismissed, insisting that it was unfair, that she had been manipulated, that he deserved everything because he was her blood. The lawyer remained calm, his face steady, and with measured words he told him that her wishes were clear, that her mind had been sound when she wrote those lines, and that there would be no contesting what was laid out so firmly. My son's anger boiled, his face flushed red, his words spilling out like a child denied a toy, and yet every outburst only seemed to strip away what little dignity he had left. I sat there watching, not rising to his accusations, not letting my own anger surface, because I knew that nothing I could say would carry the weight her letter had already delivered. She had spoken for me in the most powerful way, leaving no room for doubt, no space for his pride to twist her meaning. The more he shouted, the more the truth stood in contrast to his behavior, and the more those in the room began to see the difference between us, between a man who had given his life quietly and a son who thought respect could be demanded without ever being earned. His voice cracked as he realized the lawyer would not bend, that no argument could undo what his mother had written in her own hand. He sank back into the chair at last, defeated, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and disbelief, but beneath it all there was something else too, a flicker of shame that even he could not hide. In that moment I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only a deep ache in my chest that it had come to this, that a father and son stood on opposite sides of love and respect, divided not by wealth, but by arrogance. I wished he could have seen sooner, wished he could have honored his mother while she lived, but now the lesson had been carved into stone. She had left him nothing because he had given nothing, and she had left everything to me because she had seen me, truly seen me, for the man I was. I rose slowly from my chair, not to argue, not to speak harshly, but simply to leave that office with my head held high, carrying her words in my heart, knowing she had restored what he tried so cruelly to take from me. As I stepped out of that office, the cool air brushed against my face, and it felt as though a heavy weight had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I walked slowly down the steps, my cane tapping against the stone, each sound reminding me that I was still standing, that despite the words my son had thrown at me during the funeral, I had not been broken. Her letter was folded carefully inside my coat pocket, close to my chest, and it felt almost as though she was walking with me, her hand resting gently on mine, guiding me through the storm she knew would come. I did not feel the need to look back, because I knew what I would see, my son still sitting in that office, his pride shattered, his anger boiling, and his certainty destroyed. On the walk home, memories of her came to me one by one. The way she used to hum while cooking, the sound of her laugh when I said something foolish just to see her smile, the gentle way she held my hand when life grew hard. She had always been my voice of reason, the one who reminded me that patience carried more strength than shouting, that silence could be louder than any argument. And now, even after she was gone, she had proven herself right once again. My silence at the funeral had been mistaken for weakness, but her letter revealed the truth, that it was not silence born of fear, but silence born of trust in her, trust that she would defend me in her own way. When I reached my house, I stood for a moment at the front door, looking at the home we had built together, the walls that had held our laughter, the windows that had seen our tears. I turned the key slowly and stepped inside, the quiet pressing in on me, but instead of loneliness, I felt something else. I felt her presence in every corner, as if she had filled the house with her spirit before she left. I placed the letter carefully on the table, sat down in my chair, and let out a long breath I had been holding since the funeral. I whispered a thank you into the stillness because she had given me back my dignity. She had spoken the truth when I could not, and she had reminded me that I was never useless, never forgotten, never alone. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, I let my thoughts wander back through the years, back to every sacrifice, every struggle, and every victory my wife and I had shared. I thought about the long days I had worked when my body ached and my spirit was tired, yet I kept going because I wanted her and our family to have more than I ever did. I remembered the winters when money was thin, but our home was warm because she made it that way with her love, and I remembered the summers when laughter filled our yard as our children played, never knowing the cost of the life we had built for them. As I looked at her photograph on the mantel, I realized that her letter was not just about the inheritance. It was about something deeper, something far more lasting. It was her final gift to me, A reminder that even in silence, even when insulted and humiliated, I was not forgotten. I was not useless, and I was not alone. I thought of my son and the path he had chosen, how pride had clouded his vision, how entitlement had blinded him to the truth of what love really means. A part of me grieved for him, not because of what he had lost in material wealth, but because of what he had never learned. Respect is not something that can be demanded, it is earned through kindness, humility, and sacrifice. My wife had seen it, she had named it in her letter, and she had made sure that lesson would not be buried with her. I sat there in the stillness of that house, holding on to her words as if they were a lifeline, and I realized that this was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. As the night grew darker and the house grew quieter, I closed my eyes and felt a peace I had not known in many years. I whispered to myself that I would carry her memory not in sadness but in strength, that I would walk with my head high no matter what was said about me, and that I would let her truth guide me just as it had guided her. The letter had been her voice, but the lesson was now mine to live. And so I promised myself that I would not waste the days I had left with bitterness, but instead I would honor her by living with the same dignity she had given me. Because love, when it is true, does not end at the grave. It lives on in every choice we make after. In the days that followed, I carried myself with a quiet strength I had not felt in years. And though the pain of losing my wife still lingered, I found comfort in knowing that her love had spoken for me when I could not. Her words in that letter had restored my dignity. They had reminded me of the life we built together, and they had shown the world that respect is not measured in wealth or in titles, but in loyalty, sacrifice, and love that endures through time. My son's anger and disbelief were his burden to carry, but mine was a gift of peace, a gift of truth, and a gift of knowing that even in my silence I was never truly silent, because her voice had carried my worth farther than my own could have. And so as I sit here tonight, sharing this story with you, I hope you take from it not just the pain of betrayal, but the strength of love that endures, the kind of love that defends you even when you are gone. Thank you for staying with me until the end. It means more than I can say. If this story touched you, I ask that you subscribe, share it with others, and leave a comment below. I would love to hear your thoughts, and together we can keep these lessons alive.